In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union deployed hundreds of T-55 and T-62 tanks. Why flood the mountains with old armor? Soviet generals faced a simple arithmetic problem with no elegant answer. How to sustain a decade-long occupation without draining the heart of their armored forces? The solution was as cold as it was calculated. By the late 1970s, the Red Army's warehouses overflowed with T-55s and T-62s, products of 2 decades of mass production, now considered second line by planners in Moscow. These tanks were not chosen out of desperation or neglect, but because they were expendable. The real prize, the T-72s, T-64s, and T-80s, remained in Europe. Locked in position against NATO, their engines barely broken in, their service hours preserved for the war that never came. Doctrine shaped every decision. Soviet manuals, still echoing lessons from the Second World War, taught that tanks had a short, brutal lifespan in combat. Modern armor belonged in the West, facing the Bundeswehr and the US Army across the Fulda Gap, not in the mountains of Afghanistan. The T-55s and T-62s, with their familiar 100mm and 115mm guns, were considered more than adequate for convoy escort and infantry support against an enemy who in 1979 possessed only a handful of RPGs and almost no anti-tank guided missiles. There was no reason, in the eyes of the General Staff, to waste the best equipment on a conflict that was supposed to be quick and low risk. But the theory was tested almost immediately. In January 1980, a handful of T-64s were shipped to Afghanistan for field trials. On paper, these were the most advanced tanks in the Soviet arsenal, boasting powerful engines and cutting-edge fire control. On the ground, the T-64's engine sputtered and failed in the thin mountain air, unable to cope with the altitude and dust. Within weeks, the experiment ended. The T-64s were loaded onto transports and sent back to Europe, never to return. The verdict was clear. Afghanistan would be fought with yesterday's armor, not tomorrow's. This was not an oversight. The General Staff's calculations were deliberate, rooted in a hard logic of resource preservation and threat prioritization. The best tanks stayed in Germany, facing the possibility of a NATO invasion. Afghanistan would have to make do with the tools already on hand, even if those tools were already a generation behind the times. The gamble seemed to make sense on paper, but as the war dragged on, the limitations of this strategy would become impossible to ignore. In the Panjshir Valley, the terrain itself became the first and last word in Soviet survival. Sheer cliffs towered above narrow roads, forcing tank columns into single-file lines with nowhere to turn. Ahmad Shah Massoud's fighters watched from the high ground, waiting for the moment when Soviet armor was most exposed. The geometry of these valleys offered the perfect ambush. Destroy the lead tank to block escape, take out the rear to seal the trap, then pick off the rest at leisure. Soviet tanks, designed for the open plains of Europe, could not raise their guns high enough to return fire at attackers perched hundreds of meters above. Crews inside the steel hulls found themselves blind and helpless, unable to respond as RPGs and recoilless rifles rained down from the ridges. Early in the war, the threat was limited by supply. In 1979, the Mujahideen could field only 1 RPG for every 10 fighters. Soviet planners considered this manageable, and losses were minimal, with just a single T-55 destroyed that year. But the balance shifted as the conflict dragged on. Smuggling routes from Pakistan and China brought in more RPGs, along with heavier recoilless rifles and, by the late 1980s, anti-tank guided missiles. By 1988, the valley's kill zones had become death traps for Soviet armor. That year alone, 22 tanks were irretrievably lost, more than in any previous year. Each destroyed tank marked the convergence of 2 escalating forces, the Mujahideen's growing arsenal, and the unchanging, unforgiving geometry of Afghanistan's mountains. Massoud's command of the terrain, paired with the steady flow of new weapons, turned every convoy into a calculated risk. The next blow would fall not from open battle, but from the mountains themselves, as hardware vulnerabilities met their harshest test. T-55 and T-62 tanks arrived in Afghanistan as proven workhorses of Soviet industry. The T-55 carried a 100mm D-10T rifled gun, could reach 31 miles per hour, and wore up to 200mm of frontal armor. The T-62, with its 115mm U-5TS smoothbore, the world's first in mass production, added a Meteor stabilizer and a 620 horsepower engine, nudging weight to 37 tons. Both were designed for the open plains, not the vertical trap of Afghan valleys. Their guns could only elevate about 16 degrees, hopeless against fighters perched hundreds of meters above. Depressing the gun to fire down from ridgelines was equally limited. Mines exploited a different flaw: thin belly armor, sometimes less than 2 centimeters thick. Crews, fearing the blast more than bullets, often rode outside on the hull, risking shrapnel and small arms. Mechanical attrition was relentless. Engines strained in thin mountain air, overheating or choking on dust. Summer heat warped seals, and winter cold froze hydraulics and fuel. Maintenance collapsed under the pressure. Parts shortages meant tanks were cannibalized in the field or simply abandoned. 2 entire tank regiments were withdrawn by 1980, unable to function in the mountains. One was reorganized as a motorized rifle unit. Late in the war, the T-62M appeared with BDD applique armor, a belly plate, side skirts, and an anti-neutron liner. The upgrades helped against shaped charges, but left the core problems untouched: elevation limits, mine vulnerability, and mechanical wear. Numbers tell the rest. Of roughly 1,800 T-62s rotated through Afghanistan, Western analysts estimate about 400 were destroyed, 22% lost. Official Soviet figures admit to just 147 tanks written off, counting only irreparable combat losses. Western estimates, including mechanical failures and abandonment, put total armored vehicle losses near 1,500. At peak, 104,000 troops served at once. Over 10 years, 620,000 cycled through. The gap in the numbers is no accident. It reflects what the institution chose to count. The same blind spots reappeared in Chechnya, where T-80s burned in Grozny kill zones, and again in Ukraine, where Russian losses in 2 years have already eclipsed Afghanistan's decade. The lesson? Hardware can be upgraded, but lessons unlearned will be paid for in blood and steel, again and again. Today, Russia fields the same T-62s and T-55s that were once written off as expendable, facing modern ambushes and minefields in Ukraine. When history's harshest lessons go unheeded, iron and lives are lost twice. The mountains have changed. The cost of forgetting remains the same. Share your thoughts below. then watched disease, not enemy fire, inflict the real devastation. More than 469,000 soldiers fell sick, while the most advanced tanks often sat unused. 469,685. That is the number of Soviet soldiers sickened or wounded during the Afghan War, a figure that dwarfs the official combat death toll by more than 30 times. Disease, not bullets, hollowed out the Red Army from within. 88% of all casualties were caused by infection, not enemy fire. Hepatitis alone struck 115,308 troops, spreading through contaminated water and poor sanitation. Typhoid claimed 31,080 more. Another 140,665 suffered from dysentery, malaria, and respiratory infections, draining strength from entire battalions. Hepatitis became a strategic problem, as much as a medical one. In the summer of 1980, the 5th Motorized Rifle Division became a warning no commander could ignore. A hepatitis outbreak swept through the ranks, leaving so many men incapacitated that the division was declared combat ineffective. Tanks sat idle as crews filled sickbeds, not turrets. The epidemic was so severe that replacements could not keep up, and armored vehicles were left abandoned or cannibalized for parts. The Soviet war machine ran on manpower, but Afghanistan's bacteria and viruses proved deadlier than any ambush. Tanks were lost to sickness as often as to enemy action. The numbers tell the story. For every soldier killed in combat, more than 30 fell to disease. Entire units lost operational strength overnight, with medical records showing hundreds sidelined in a single week. Numbers like these quietly eroded combat power. The official statistics list 14,453 killed in action and 53,753 wounded. Those figures mask the true scale of attrition. Official totals do not capture the daily drain. Behind those figures, nearly 500,000 soldiers cycled through fever, jaundice, and exhaustion, their absence quietly eroding the fighting force. As the epidemic wore on, tanks became monuments to lost crews, left behind in mountain passes or stripped for spare parts. The arithmetic of disease shaped every decision that followed, from force structure to equipment abandonment. Arithmetic decided whether a vehicle was driven or left. In Afghanistan, the Red Army faced an enemy it could not shoot, and every sickbed was another tank left without a crew.